You've already decided about the last person you met, before they finished their first sentence, before you knew their name correctly, before you had any meaningful information about who they actually are. You had already formed a judgment, assigned them a category, built a preliminary model of their intelligence, their trustworthiness, their warmth, their status, and filed it as a working assumption you would spend the rest of your interaction confirming. This is not a character flaw. It is the default operation of a human brain doing what it was built to do: assess other people as quickly as possible, with as little information as possible, in order to determine how to behave toward them. And it is one of the most consequential cognitive processes in human life, not because the judgments are malicious, but because they are remarkably fast, remarkably confident, remarkably resistant to revision, and remarkably inaccurate in the ways that matter most. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly what your brain does in the first 30 seconds of meeting someone. The research on how fast these judgments form, how much information they use, and how accurate they actually are, and why the process, despite its limitations, has proven extraordinarily difficult to override. There is a researcher named Nalini Ambady. She was a social psychologist at Tufts University who spent her career studying what she called thin slices of behavior, very brief exposures to another person from which observers make judgments about that person's characteristics. Her research established something that challenged the assumption that accurate social judgment requires sustained observation. In one of her most famous studies, Ambady showed participants silent 30-second video clips of teachers in their classrooms. Participants who had never met these teachers rated them on dimensions like warmth, confidence, and perceived teaching effectiveness. Those ratings correlated significantly with the ratings of students who had spent an entire semester in those teachers' classes. 30 seconds of silent video versus a semester of direct experience. The thin slice was remarkably predictive. Subsequent research extended this finding across domains. 30-second audio clips predicted counselor effectiveness ratings by clients across therapy relationships. Brief video observations predicted business negotiation outcomes. Even less, even 2-second exposure, produced judgments that, in some domains, correlated meaningfully with longer-term assessments. The brain is extraordinarily fast at extracting social information from minimal cues, and the information it extracts is not entirely random. In some domains, under some conditions, the snap judgments are genuinely informative. But in others, and this is the part that matters most, they are systematically biased in ways that produce consistent errors. Errors that we rarely recognize as errors. Because we are rarely in a position to compare our first impressions against the actual truth of the people we were forming them about. Here is what the brain is actually doing in those first 30 seconds. The process begins before conscious awareness, before the introduction is complete, before any deliberate evaluation has occurred. The brain's threat assessment system, centered in the amygdala, begins evaluating the person in front of you within milliseconds of visual contact. Trustworthiness assessments, specifically, begin in approximately 100 milliseconds, a tenth of a second, based on facial structure alone. Alexander Todorov at Princeton University has documented the facial features most reliably associated with trustworthiness judgments: facial width-to-height ratio, the degree of facial expressiveness, the angle of eyebrows, the curvature of the mouth. None of these features actually predict trustworthiness. They predict the perception of trustworthiness, but the brain does not distinguish between the two. The initial assessment is not a hypothesis. It is experienced as a perception, as the direct reading of a property that seems to be actually there. In the same way that the illusions of perceptual psychology feel like reality, the social evaluation of a new person feels like seeing something true, not inferring, seeing. This phenomenological quality, the experience of direct perception rather than inference, is one of the things that makes first impressions so resistant to revision. You know what you saw. You're not aware that what you saw was an interpretation. Here is the mechanism that converts the initial judgment from a working hypothesis into a self-confirming belief. It is called confirmation bias. Once the initial impression is formed, within the first 30 seconds, based on minimal information, the brain begins selectively processing subsequent information in ways that favor confirmation of that impression. Evidence consistent with the initial judgment is noticed, weighted, remembered. Evidence inconsistent with the initial judgment is discounted, explained away, or simply not registered. This is not deliberate. It is automatic, a feature of how the cognitive system maintains internal consistency. And it is extraordinarily powerful. Research by psychologist Mark Snyder at the University of Minnesota documented a specific mechanism through which initial impressions not only filter subsequent information, but actively generate confirmatory evidence. Snyder had participants conduct structured interviews with targets. Participants who had been told in advance that their target was introverted asked different questions than participants told the target was extroverted. They asked questions whose answers would confirm the expectation regardless of the target's actual personality. The interaction itself was structured differently by the expectation. And the answers produced, shaped by the questions, confirmed the expectation. The impression didn't just filter reality. It created it. This is called behavioral confirmation, or in its most famous formulation, the self-fulfilling prophecy. The initial impression shapes how you behave toward the person. How you behave toward the person shapes how they respond. How they respond provides evidence that confirms the initial impression. The person who was expected to be unfriendly was treated coolly, responded in kind, was judged as unfriendly. The person who was expected to be warm was engaged with warmth, responded warmly, was judged as warm. Neither judgment was necessarily inaccurate by the time it was made, but neither was it tested against an accurate counterfactual. The impression became the truth through its own influence on the interaction. Here is the specific content of what the brain judges in the first 30 seconds. Research by Amy Cuddy at Harvard Business School, synthesizing findings from social psychology and impression formation research, identified two primary dimensions that account for the majority of social judgment variance: warmth and competence. These two dimensions are not equally weighted. Warmth is assessed first and carries more weight in initial impression formation. The first question the brain asks about a new person is not, "Is this person capable?" It is, "Is this person safe? Do their intentions toward me seem benign?" Only after the warmth assessment is complete, within seconds, does the competence assessment proceed. This prioritization is ancient. In an ancestral environment, the first question upon encountering another person was survival relevant. Is this individual a threat or an ally? Does their intent toward me seem hostile or benign? Competence, whether they are effective, capable, skilled, is a secondary consideration. It matters less if the person's capabilities are oriented against you. The warmth first, competence second hierarchy is the fingerprint of a social brain evolved for navigating a world where threat assessment was the primary challenge. And here is where the first significant source of systematic error appears. The features that trigger warmth assessments in the amygdala and the associated brain regions responsible for social judgment are not reliably connected to the property of actually being warm, benign, or trustworthy. They are connected to the features that, across evolutionary history, correlated with warmth in the specific environments your ancestors navigated. Features that were present in trustworthy people, more often than in untrustworthy ones. On average, under conditions that may not apply to modern environments. Facial features, posture, tone of voice, speed of movement, similarity to people the brain has previously categorized as safe. All of these produce warmth judgments. None of them reliably predict actual warmth, trustworthiness, or benign intent in any individual case. The judgment is statistically valid in the sense that it performs above chance across large populations under certain conditions. It is individually unreliable in the sense that the specific person in front of you may have every warmth cue and be genuinely untrustworthy, or no warmth cue and be genuinely one of the most trustworthy people you will ever meet. The brain does not know this. It responds to the cue, not to the underlying property. Here is the research on exactly how wrong first impressions can be, and in what specific domains the errors are most consequential. In hiring decisions, research by economists and organizational psychologists has found that interviewers form strong impressions of candidates within the first few minutes, sometimes the first 30 seconds, of an interview. Those impressions predict hiring decisions with high reliability. They do not reliably predict job performance. The features that produce positive first impressions in interview contexts, confident posture, clear articulation, physical attractiveness, vocal resonance, are only weakly correlated with the actual skills required for most jobs. The interview, in many settings, is essentially a first impression formation exercise with a thin veneer of informational value. In judicial contexts, research has found that defendants whose faces are judged as less trustworthy in quick exposures, before any information about the case, receive longer sentences for the same crimes than defendants whose faces are judged as more trustworthy. The face, the first impression, affecting the outcome of a formal legal process. In medical contexts, research has found that patients whose physical appearance produces positive first impressions receive more attentive care, more time, more thorough examination, more responsiveness to their stated concerns, than patients whose appearance produces less positive first impressions, regardless of the actual severity of their condition. The first impression is shaping outcomes in systems specifically designed to be immune to it, because the first impression is not operating at the level of deliberate decision-making. It is operating upstream, in the level of attention allocation, question framing, and information processing that precedes the decisions we are aware of making. Here is the finding that is perhaps most practically significant. The first impression is difficult to override because it is not primarily a cognitive process. It operates through the same perceptual channels as sensory information. Research by Bertram Goronsky at the University of Western Ontario on implicit attitudes found that initial social evaluations, the kind formed in the first 30 seconds, are stored differently from deliberately formed beliefs. Deliberately formed beliefs are stored propositionally. Person X has characteristic Y because of reason Z. They are explicitly available, easily verbalized, and responsive to new logical argument. Initial social evaluations are stored associatively. Person X is associated with positive or negative affect. They are implicit, not easily verbalized, and resistant to revision through argument alone. This means that telling someone their first impression is wrong, or telling yourself, does not access the representation that needs to be changed. The deliberate, propositional belief can be updated. The associative, implicit evaluation remains. And behavior is shaped more by the implicit evaluation than by the deliberate belief. The person who consciously believes the candidate is qualified may still behave, in subtle ways, consistently with the initial negative impression, making less eye contact, asking slightly less generous follow-up questions, interpreting ambiguous responses less charitably. The update happened at the explicit level. The first impression remained at the implicit level. And the implicit level is where most of social behavior is actually generated. What actually reduces the influence of first impressions is not argument or deliberate correction. It is what researchers call controlled processing, the deliberate allocation of cognitive resources to the specific task of evaluating a person more carefully. Controlled processing requires something that most social interactions do not provide: time, attention, and motivation to revise. Time, because the initial impression consolidates rapidly and requires extended contact to accumulate sufficient counter-evidence. Attention, because the revision requires deliberately noticing information that the confirmation bias would otherwise route around. Motivation, because the cognitive effort of controlled processing competes with the brain's default preference for the efficiency of automatic impression formation. Research by Patricia Devine at the University of Wisconsin on prejudice reduction found that people who were most successful at reducing the influence of their implicit biases were not people who had fewer biases. They were people who had developed stronger internal motivation to be accurate, combined with stronger habits of noticing when their automatic judgments were influencing their behavior. The awareness of the process, the motivation to correct for it, and the specific habit of catching the moment when the first impression is shaping behavior before the behavior is complete. Not elimination of first impressions. That is not achievable. Reduction of their influence through the specific and effortful practice of noticing them and choosing how much weight to give them. You've already decided about the last person you met. That's where we started. And now you know what that process actually was. Not character assessment, not accurate reading of who the person is. A millisecond threat assessment by an amygdala optimized for ancestral environments. A warmth judgment based on facial features with limited predictive validity. A cascade of confirmation bias that shaped subsequent attention and interaction to produce evidence for the conclusion that was drawn before the conversation began. Not malicious, not stupid, simply fast. Faster than you were aware of, faster than deliberate evaluation. Operating at a level of processing that precedes the experience of thinking. The 30 seconds in which you committed what this video has called the universal human sin was not a moral failure. It was a neurological event, running exactly as designed, producing the quick social assessment that human survival in groups has always required. The failure, if there is one, is not in the process. It is in the assumption that the process is more accurate than it is, in the confidence with which you filed the first impression as a reading of truth. In the subsequent hours, days, or years of interaction filtered through an assessment formed before you knew the person's name. That assumption can be revised. Not by eliminating the fast assessment. It cannot be eliminated. By holding it more lightly, by treating it as a hypothesis rather than a perception, by staying curious about the person in front of you long enough to find out what the first 30 seconds could not possibly have shown you, which in almost every case is most of who they actually are. If the science behind how your mind forms judgments and how those judgments shape your life matters to you, subscribe. No self-improvement promises, no social skills tips, just the cognitive science that holds up and what it means for how you understand yourself and the people around you. The next video goes into why you remember people differently than they actually were, and what the research says about the gap between the person you knew and the person you remember. Hit subscribe. That one is worth staying for. There is a specific finding from cross-cultural research on first impressions that adds an important dimension to everything described so far. The content of first impressions, what specifically is assessed and how it is weighted, is not entirely universal. While the speed of impression formation and the basic architecture of warmth and competence appear consistently across cultures, the specific cues used to assess those dimensions vary in ways that reveal how much of the process is culturally shaped rather than purely biological. Research by social psychologists studying impression formation across cultures found significant variation in the role of contextual information versus dispositional attributes. In North American and Western European contexts, first impressions tend to be strongly dispositional, focused on the individual's apparent personal characteristics, inferred from their behavior and appearance independent of context. In East Asian cultural contexts, first impressions tend to give significantly more weight to contextual information, what role the person is playing, what the situation demands, what the social context suggests about the appropriateness of their behavior. This difference has direct implications for how accurate first impressions are in cross-cultural contexts. The dispositional inference that works reasonably well within a cultural community, where the cues are calibrated to a shared set of norms, can produce serious errors across cultural boundaries, where the same behavior carries different meaning. The person whose behavior triggers warmth cues in one cultural context may be following norms that produce exactly those cues without any underlying warmth. The person whose behavior fails to trigger warmth cues may simply be operating in a different social register that signals warmth differently. The first impression does not just use fast, minimal information. It uses fast, minimal information filtered through a cultural lens that was calibrated to a specific community. Applied to people from different cultural contexts, it is less reliable than it is within the community for which it was shaped, and yet it is experienced with the same confidence, the same felt quality of direct perception, the same certainty that you have seen something true. In a world of increasing cross-cultural contact, in professional environments, in diverse communities, in global communication, this is among the most consequential and most frequently overlooked sources of systematic error in first impressions. There is a finding from research on physical attractiveness and first impressions that deserves direct, honest examination. Because it is one of the most extensively documented and most consistently under-acknowledged sources of systematic bias in social judgment. Research by Karen Dion, Ellen Berscheid, and Elaine Wolster in their 1972 paper, with a title that has become famous in social psychology, documented what they called the "what is beautiful is good" effect. Physically attractive individuals are attributed automatically and without deliberate reflection a range of positive characteristics that have nothing to do with their physical appearance: greater warmth, greater intelligence, greater social competence, greater moral character. Across dozens of replications, across cultures, across different definitions of physical attractiveness, the effect is remarkably consistent, and its consequences are correspondingly consequential. Attractive defendants are convicted less often for the same crimes. Attractive job candidates are hired more often for the same qualifications. Attractive students receive higher grades for the same work. Attractive individuals are helped more by strangers, trusted more by peers, and given more benefit of the doubt in ambiguous social situations. None of these outcomes are the result of deliberate discrimination. The people making these judgments are not aware that physical attractiveness is influencing them. Many would deny it if asked, because the influence is not operating at the level of deliberate, conscious decision. It is operating at the level of the automatic warmth and competence assessments that formed in the first 30 seconds. Before the deliberate evaluation began, before any decision was consciously made, the first impression is not separate from the decision. It is the foundation on which the decision was built, and by the time deliberate evaluation arrives, the first impression has already shaped which information was noticed, how it was interpreted, and what standard of evidence was required to support the emerging judgment. The 30-second window at the beginning of every social encounter is not a brief preliminary. It is, for many of the most consequential judgments humans make about each other, the primary event. Everything that follows is, more often than we realize, the working out of a conclusion that was already drawn.